You can be white if you want to, or you can be Native American, depending on what the particular tribal group you say you're part of has in terms of what you have to have ancestry-wise to be a member. So right there's a different discussion. Part Asian people, part Latino, although that gets really complicated because according to our census, Latinos are an ethnic group. They're the only ethnic group in the country, and they're not a racial group. It's like, okay, we have two ethnic groups, Latino, or as they say, Hispanic, and non-Hispanic. And it's like, oh, okay, well, but you could be racially white, according to the Census Bureau, and still be a Latino ethnic person. Very interesting politics behind that, which I won't have time to go into, but it's in the book. The fact of the matter is that when it came to people of African descent, in order to increase the number of slaves, to make sure that every offspring of a slave owner, even if it was a loving relationship, most often not, but most of it was the product of rape, or extended concubine, as you might call it, it guaranteed, if you say, well, everybody who has one African American forebearer is automatically an African American and therefore enslavable, it works quite well economically. You've got your expanded labor force. And in some parts of the South, in fact, a lot of observers from the North noticed, and a lot of abolitionists used this to critique slavery, they would see all these blue-eyed blonde slaves. And it was like, oh, how could you enslave these people? You know, it's like, well, what about the people in the field that are very African looking? But in order to appeal to what we might call the white supremacist conscience of even some of the abolitionists and people who were horrified by slavery, they were not necessarily horrified by the institution, but the fact that you were enslaving what they thought visually at least were ostensibly white people. And yet the one-drop rule says, no, they're black. So clearly, the one-drop rule is an extreme kind of hypo-descent. It's like, well, it's not 3/4, I don't care, you know, 2/8. It's like, if I find out you have anyone in your lineage who's African-American 400 years back, that's a bit of a stretch, but essentially the argument is, if it's there at all, automatically, I expect you to let me treat you as a second-class citizen. I expect you to understand that you cannot partake in any of the privileges of whiteness, and don't even go there. And certainly don't even try to be a multiracial person, because we just don't have any. So right there, the whole social construction of blackness has a very unique place in United States jurisprudence, and part of the topic of the book is to really deal with that. And yet I would have to say that this discussion around multiraciality is not a black-white thing. It involves numerous combinations, but because of the specificity of blackness, I chose to look at it that way. And then also, if you notice in any discussions around issues of race, multiraciality, etc., you put black with anything and people get really nervous. You know, Tiger Woods has never been referred to as really a multiracial golfer. He's an African-American golfer. They don't know what to do with Keanu Reeves. I hope I can say this. I really don't have any idea. You have to let me know where you're going to show this video if you do, because I'm not attacking him. I'm just saying the public perceptions of him, maybe he's white, maybe, you know, he's a surfer, I don't know. Maybe he's a frat boy, I don't know. Maybe he's Asian American, maybe he's European American, maybe he's mixed, I don't know. Students in my class have often said Keanu Reeves is white. Well, that has never been said about Tiger Woods. Obviously, they might look at Keanu Reeves differently physically. Mariah Carey went through a terrible firestorm because she forgot to tell people she was part black. Now, why that happened, it's a good question. But the fact of the matter is, it is not necessarily easier for individuals to identify as multiracial, and I don't want to say that their experience is less complicated and less tormented by other people if they don't have African ancestry. I'm simply saying that there are specificities that come with the social construction of blackness in this country, that you can't just be a little black. You either are or you aren't. Whereas there is some negotiability, and I say it's relative depending on the historical time period, depending on the individual experience, the gender, the socioeconomic class. But certainly black and white are very definitive in many ways, certainly of the history of race in this country, and particularly around this issue. And if you notice, in terms of designators, everyone in the country has what we would call an ethno-racial label. Asian Americans, Latino Americans, or Hispanics, Native Americans. But the black and white become racialized with a color. And even though African American terminology is kind of shifting back and forth between African American and black, I rarely hear anyone refer to European Americans as just European Americans. White is a category which has a correlation historically with Europeanness, but it's not just limited to being a person of European descent. And one of the concerns that African Americans have particularly expressed about multiracial identity is that for so long in this country, the one-drop rule has been so clear in defining who's black and who's not. That was the very tool, actually, that served as the foundation for the civil rights movement, that actually ultimately undermined the legitimacy of the one-drop rule when you take it to its logical conclusion by removing laws against interracial marriage. But by virtue of the clarity that that device has provided people, on both sides of the fence actually, but certainly in terms of membership in the African American community, any discussion about anything in between or fuzzy or gray immediately alerts people to the fact, okay, here is the chance for people to jump ship. Whiteness is expanding in ways that it has never been able to do historically. People will no longer have to be just black anymore, and we know there are a ton of people waiting on the edge of the ship just to do that. And so there are terrible fears based on the legitimate history of the stigma attached to blackness in this country that make African Americans extremely uncomfortable with any discussion of fuzzying a blackness by adding a little bit white to it, making it gray in terms of identity. Because all African Americans know, for the most part, that they have some European and or Native American ancestry. So it's not a discussion about that. It's the concern about, well, what will these people identify as? The irony is that the civil rights movement, by pushing for opening up public facilities, dismantling Jim Crow, ultimately laid the foundation for the dismantling of the laws against interracial marriage, which had really been implemented early on in the colonial period. And as part of this, in the private world, people began to choose partners, perhaps that were of a different background beginning in 1967, which is not to say that marriage is a neutral choice. I'm not saying that there are not all kinds of influences that make people choose partners. I'm simply saying that the option was not even legally available in many parts of the United States up until 1967. Opening that up in conjunction with the opening up of the public schools, the workplace, etc., gave people to have opportunity to interact with each other in ways that had never been possible previously. And when these people, of course, dated, married, and had offspring, the climate in the larger society was also changing to some extent, even though blackness may not have been given the value that it is due. Certainly the stigma that had been attached previously with slavery and the Jim Crow era was changing. And parents were trying to bring both identities to the offspring. That was a very different process that had not really been part of the socialization in the United States. People who have had interracial offspring, even previously, have typically socialized them as African American. The children have identified as African American, grown up within the African American community in varying ways, and had no question about what they were. And I'm making a generalization there when I say that, but what I'm saying is that though the option was there, if you look at the parents, they did have parents that were from two different backgrounds, who had two different identities. The choice for socialization and identity did not necessarily enter the picture. Well, over time, clearly these children, and this is where the real discussion enters the picture, African Americans have been multi-generational, multiracial for 400 years, but they've all identified as African American, and that is essentially where the discussion has ended. Even if there has been color discrimination and color hierarchy among African Americans, as there are among many other groups, in terms of the closer you look to being a European American, the more opportunity you may have and the more prestige you may have among African Americans, they were still always African American, even if only, how should I say, even if the connection was a fragile one. It was clear that, well, these are light-skinned black people. When you start talking about multiraciality, it's not light-skinned black anymore. It's actually talking about something different, and so people don't understand, well, what does this mean now? Because you say you're a biracial or a multiracial person, well, does that mean you want to use your white background to now gain advantages that other people who don't have that do? What are you trying to tell me? And so what we have happening is the old history of white supremacy and white domination has kind of gotten infused in the current discussion about an identity that is totally different in terms of the source, the origin, and the articulation of it, which doesn't mean that everybody who says that they're multiracial is going out there being a racial ambassador. What it's saying is that previously, when people could not identify as a multiracial, the reason that they embraced, in this case, a European background was they wanted the advantages of white privilege. And it was like, okay, I don't want to be on the bottom. I don't want to go to the back of the bus. Let me go to the middle of the bus. And so people used their part whiteness, shall we say, previously in a variety of different strategies that I go in the book to say, well, don't treat me like one of them because I'm almost like you. And since you won't let me be one of you because of the one-drop rule, give me a break. Put me in the middle somewhere. Well, the whole new multiracial identity is also talking about a middling positioning, but it's not saying